Chapter 16, Hunting 57, New Ford Tractor, House Improvement, Water System. In April of 1957, the Dunworkin Hunt Club decided to eliminate the hassle of hiring transportation of our goods to our new camp by purchasing our own truck. We found a 15 CWT four-wheel drive, 1940 model Chev Army truck, owned and used as a wrecker tow truck by Mr. Taylor at Elfrida, which we bought for $425. As it already had a winch, all that was required to make it serviceable was a platform and racks. The summer holidays on the DeWitt farm rarely exceeded more than 3 days, which were carefully chosen to coincide with the fruit harvest. 1957 was no exception, and in an effort to share some of my enthusiasm and pride of ownership of the ultimate hunt club in Ontario with my family, Florence, Norma, Lib, and myself drove to Jarve's Lost Channel Inn. It was my hope that the three of us would walk that famous 4 mile to the camp and return the same day, but Lib, after due consideration, decided her short legs were a disadvantage and let Flo and I go it alone. This was the first year I owned a movie camera, and I got several good shots on the way there. You may be able to imagine my disappointment to find that the snow of the previous winter had collapsed the roof. The peak of the roof now rested on the floor, the west wall laid on the ground, and the remaining 3 walls were on a precarious angle. This was the roof John had jokingly claimed you could drive a team of horses over. I took pictures from every angle, which I hoped would show what was required to put it back in condition. It surely knocked the fun out of the trip for me, but Flo seemed to enjoy it in spite of losing her glasses somewhere along the trail. At home, the news was received with a "what do we do now" attitude, and it seemed like a good time to prove the value of the truck. The work party included John, Frank, Ellis, Murray, myself, and one of our associate members, George Lonsbury, for a total of 6. John and I drove the truck. That was an experience in itself. Being a right-hand drive, the gear shift was on the driver's left side, and what was worse, the accelerator foot feed was positioned between the brake and the clutch pedals. The cab was about 6 feet wide, but the motor was boxed in the center, leaving it strictly 2-passenger capacity. Because it was heavy and strong, 8,000 pounds, top speed was slightly over 50 miles per hour, and there is no point in talking to each other once you pass 35, because the motor and gears made such a noise. We had been advised that Highway 103 was now open for the first time to the public, a direct route from Wabashine to McTier on number 69, about 30 miles and a shortcut for us. Darkness fell just past Wabashine, and our headlights were a little better than a pair of candles. 103 was straight and level, and we seemed to be the only ones driving on this new gravel road. It was my turn to drive, and after we had gone for more than 10 miles without seeing either curves or traffic, I pushed for more speed. Then, suddenly, without signs of warning or any other indications, the road dropped out of sight and the headlights shone into a total void of darkness. I jammed on the brakes as hard as I could, and when John and I got out of the cab, we were looking at a river 50 or more feet straight down. The temporary road went to our left, over a shaky bridge, and up a hill on the other side, which required 4-wheel drive and our second lowest gear to climb to the top, where 103 continued on the same as before. The next one we were more or less prepared for, and the results were not nearly as dramatic. John and I slept at Jarve's in one of his cabins. We found in the morning that the other 4 had arrived in the wee hours of the morning and, being unable to find which cabin we were in, spent a poor few hours trying to get sleep in Ellis's car. Breakfast at Jarve's, and we headed out. The trail was no better than when we last used it, so we spent a few hours cutting logs to corduroy the wet holes as we came to them. Unfortunately, we learned too late that we should have cut the logs 8 feet long instead of 6. It was just too easy to run off the edge. Once off, it required the winch to pull itself out. We arrived in camp too late to start rebuilding, so we ate and discussed our line of attack for the next day. 5 slept on the platform of the truck, which was rather crowded, and Frank Lee, with his sleeping bag, took the floor of the hunt camp, where there was enough room to squeeze under the collapsed roof. We were wakened in the night to hear Frank yelling, "Get the hell out of here!" and frequent thumps of his falling cane told us Frank had trouble. Frank had arthritis, which seriously limited the movement of his legs, and it was quite a relief to hear him say it was only a porcupine on a short visit. Luckily, the weather was good and we got an early start on a job that was tougher than building the first time. At one point, we had props from the floor to the peak of the building and also heavy gauge wire strung from one side wall to the other to prevent them from going out on top again. All but Frank agreed the upright prop should remain until we could nail more cross pieces in the roof rafters to increase the strength of the entire building. I would surmise that this was one of Frank's bath arthritic days, and everyone seemed willing to make allowance for his stubborn and irritable mood, but nobody expected him to go against the better judgment of the entire group. After presenting all his arguments without gaining any support for his theory, he shuffled over to a corner, picked up an axe, and in less time than it takes to tell, he drove 3 of those props out. The center of the peak must have fallen at least a foot, and for one split second, we all thought the building was going to go to the ground again, this time on top of us. I think that was as close as we ever came to expelling one of our members. It took an extra hour to jack the roof and replace the needed props, and a heck of a lot longer to see any humor in that episode. This must have been sometime in August because there were no black flies and the weather was dry. We at least had it all ready for the coming fall hunt. Think about this for a minute. We made up-teen trips to the North Country, built and rebuilt the camp, built racks and platform on the truck, and logged many of the mud holes, and yet Elmer Wilson had the nerve to name it Dunworkin. Fall and the hunt season finally came again, and our crew included John R., Ellis C., Bing H., Ira Lee, Frank L., George H., Dick H., Elmer W., Murray, and myself, 10 for 1957. It is my guess that we left the four-wheel drive at Jarvis after the repair job in August, rather than drive it home and back again for the hunt, but those I talk to now are no more positive than myself. We started out from Lost Channel with everything on the truck and got stuck in the mud on the first clay hill, which was no more than half a mile in the bush. We played out the cable, fastened it around a big tree, and soon found out it was too big a load for the winch to handle. After much discussion, a couple of the men walked back and hired a team of horses and a lumber wagon to haul all our goods to camp. The team was not available until the next day, so all but Ira and myself stayed overnight at Jarvis. Ira was reluctant to leave all of our supplies unprotected, so he volunteered to sleep in the truck. No arguments could convince him that this was not necessary, so rather than leave him alone, I stayed with him. Luckily, we were taking more mattresses to camp, so we arranged them on top of the supplies and had a fairly comfortable bed. Only one bad aspect, the truck was stuck on such a steep hill it was difficult to be sure if we were laying or standing when we climbed under the covers. The horses and wagon were the right kind of equipment for travel on that trail if you were willing to risk a broken leg or two. A good share of the entire trail was submerged under muddy water from 6 inches to a foot deep, and the bottom contained anything from rotten stumps to healthy boulders, and of course our corduroy parts were certainly not built for horses. In spite of everything, we arrived in camp without mishap. A couple of days later, a few of us walked back out and drove the empty truck to camp so that we would have transportation for the homeward trip. The score for this season is a total blank in my mind, but you may be sure we all had plenty of laughs at 100 small happenings. This was definitely the place to do all those things that were contrary to the rules of civilized living, without fear of criticism or interruption. No radio, no telephone or TV, no inquisitive neighbors or inhibiting laws to prevent you from doing what you please, cursing if you'd like, spitting when you want, and for scratching where it itches. Generally speaking, our gang have always been willing to abide by the hunting laws, and regardless of the fact that we were not likely to be caught hunting on Sunday, we took that day off anyway. The Sunday at the beginning of the second week was spent trying a little target practice or adding some minor improvement to the camp. It was during the shooting that Elmer Wilson, who should have known better, stood 6 or 8 feet off to the side of the shooter, but perhaps a foot or two ahead of the muzzle of the gun. It was a heavy caliber gun, and the concussion from the next shot deafened the ear closest to the shooter. Elmer was a crack shot himself and had plenty of past experience with guns to know that his already dulled hearing demanded better care. His hearing became progressively worse from that time forward, and by the next year's hunt season rolled around, Elmer declined the invitation to go with us. 1957 was his last hunt trip. By 1960, it was evident that he would not be going with us again, so we refunded the $100 and granted him an honorary membership in the club he had enjoyed so much. The trip out of the bush was a real gamble with no winch on the truck, but we made it somehow without wasting too much time. We found that the government weigh scale, located near Parry Sound, was open for business, and we drove our extra special hunt vehicle on the scales with all the pride in the world. We soon found out that the 8,000-pound license, which no one had given a second thought, was just big enough to cover the empty truck, and that all the load, which amounted to another 3,000 pounds, was overweight. The two officers in charge had all the sympathy in the world for our position. We had spent $36 for the license and $20 for liability insurance to make one 265-mile trip, and for the same price, we could drive every day for 6 months. I firmly believe if either of the officers had been alone, there would have been no fine for us to pay, but as one of the officers was from Toronto and the other from London, and just recently put together, neither would run the risk of letting us go. I wrote a letter to the Department of Transport, but we paid the $30 fine anyway. In 1954, the twins, Bert and Bill Metcalf, were working for the tractor division of Ford in Detroit, actually Royal Oak. On our frequent visits back and forth, we had discussed the possibility of me buying a tractor Ford, which had been used for experimental work or maintenance. The employees were given the privilege of choosing from 100 or more used tractors in varied conditions of mechanical fitness, and priced by the company for dealer purchase. Bert phoned one Monday morning to say that tomorrow was the day he had made arrangements to show me what was available to him. With very little preparation, Lim and I jumped into our old 1948 two-ton Ford truck and headed towards Detroit. The books show that this was sometime in September. Tuesday morning found us browsing through an unbelievable line of tractors and equipment, all priced far below my wildest hopes. This was Ford's test program, so there were many makes of tractors besides Ford, and at the far end of the property there were several tractors being driven under load around a quarter-mile dirt track. Each tractor was individually priced according to how many hours it had worked, what damage was incurred, general appearance, etc. It looked as though the more you spent time, the more you saved, so I picked out the one I considered to be the best. The price was $1,055, a savings to me of about $800. Of course, the whole thing is a sort of a hush-hush deal, and I just now learned that the terms are cash or certified check, and me with about $15 in my pocket. Keep in mind that this is only 3 years after the bonfire, and I am just beginning to see daylight shining through the pile of debts. Bert had to punch in for work at noon, so it was up to his wife, Marion, to introduce me to their bank manager in Royal Oak. We paraded into that bank looking like a total worth of a little over 60 cents. She with her hair in curls and me in work clothes to ask for a certified check for over $1,000. After introductions were over, a natural reluctance to grant my request prompted me to suggest that he telephone my manager in Stony Creek. Now here's the problem. I can't remember Mr. Miller's name, who had just recently replaced Walter Scott, who had just retired. Lucky for me, he was busy using the phone and talking at the same time, and before he had a chance to ask me the name, a clerk answered the phone and he merely said, "Could I speak to the manager, please?" What a relief. During the course of introductions on the phone, Miller's name was mentioned at my end, and I was home free. Miller okayed the request, but asked to speak to me. I thanked him for his help, and the first thing he asked me was, "Will you be all right?" I replied, "Oh, sure, I'll fix it up as soon as I get home." Being a poor bookkeeper, I did not realize that I was already overdrawn on my account by $800. Little wonder he should ask, "Will you be all right?" Give the man his due, he never mentioned it on the phone, for obvious reasons, and it was a real shock to me the next day. We proudly presented the marked check to the Ford Company, loaded the tractor, and started for home. We had to go through a customs broker at the border, but as there is no duty on agricultural implements, all that I had to prove was that I was a farmer. I think the cost was about $10. As we approached Chatham, the truck started to act up a bit, an ignition problem of some kind that cut the motor completely off for a few yards of travel, and then back on. The Ford dealer was not hard to find that the mechanic discovered a small wire in the distributor had become bare of insulation, which was periodically shorting out. The bill came to almost as much money as I had left, something like $4 for labor and 39 cents for the wire. As we counted the few pieces of change that were left, I asked Lib which she would rather do, eat or walk. There was not enough to buy food and gas, and a decided risk that we would not make home even if we spent it all on gas, so neither choice looked too good. I left the truck in the garage while I walked to the nearest bank, which happened to be a Royal Bank, and after much talk, they cashed my personal check for $20. It pleased me that it was not necessary to phone Mr. Miller again, because I thought that relationship might be somewhat strained. From Chatham to home, about 140 miles, went great, and that tractor served for several years. In fact, until I bought my first diesel with Bert's help from the same yard. Mr. Cliff Nicholson, the father of one of Flo's girlfriends, who lived within 2 miles of home, was happy to pay me within a few dollars of my cost. Our house improvement project for 1955 had been a new bathroom. The old steel tank used for a septic tank was shot, and we wanted to use a small bedroom for our new bathroom. Everything worked out just great. Charlie Bodden had just gone into business for himself, and his work as a plumber was beyond reproach, and as my financial position was such that I could afford to hire some expert help, instead of bungling through myself, Charlie was elected. Charlie and Clara had a childless marriage, and consequently his patience with children was rather short. Norma was just 3 years old, a going concern, and anxious to be friendly, so it looked as though we were heading for a lot of trouble. During his first day on the job, he paid as little attention as possible to the little nuances, and when the end of the day came, he locked all his tools securely with special instructions that they were to be untouched. You have never seen a kid try harder to win a friend. She stood by and watched, at a respectable distance, for the best part of the day, chattering and smiling whenever the opportunity presented itself. By the third day, she was offering Charlie an apple when the notion hit her, and when he accepted the first one, he must have known he was hooked. As the days passed, their friendship grew stronger, and it was most interesting to see Charlie's smile get larger and larger when Norma met him at the door each morning. Before the job was finished, she was fetching tools, handing pieces to him, or just acting as general helper, and it was evident that Charlie enjoyed every minute. Even though the fixtures were pink, it was Norma's green bathroom, and it suited Charlie just fine. We became better acquainted with Charlie and Clara a few years later, when he joined the Dunwork and Hunt Club, and they both held a high place among our friends. The struggle to get enough water to feed pigs and spray trees ended in 1957. The drilled well in the center of the barn had a good flow of water, but the casing was only 6 inches in diameter, which limited the reserve supply. The pressure pump would deliver about 30 gallons before the water level would drop below its reach. 20 minutes later, another 30 gallons was available, so with the aid of a sub-pump switch and a couple of Alka-Seltzer bottles suspended on a thin wire in the well, it was possible to keep the overhead tank full. The pump was required to work a good part of the day and night, but the system was prone to mechanical failure and a real source of trouble. The next attempt was a pond at the foot of the escarpment. Luckily, I was able to find Coles Trucking of Grimsby, who would dig the hole in exchange for the earth that was in it. We anticipated a good supply of water to the pond, because it was always wet on the surface before we started to dig, and George Lonsbury's water witch promised a good flow at 15 feet deep. It was 1,500 feet from the barn, and the bottom of the pond was about level with the east troughs, which gave us about 20 feet of a fall and consequently lots of water pressure, or so it would seem. I dug a trench 1 foot wide and about 6 feet deep from the edge of the pond to a small cement tank, then filled the trench with small-sized crushed stone, its full length of 20 feet. From the cement tank, we buried a 3/4-inch plastic pipe below frost level all the way to the barn, a T in the line, and continued on to the house. The little trickle of water that came out of the pipe was a real disappointment. It would compare favorably with the stream one would expect from a spout of a small teapot. To add insult to injury, the water had such a high mineral content that it was useless as washing water in the house, certainly not one of Clifford's better ideas. The pressure system was still necessary for the adequate supply for both house and barn, and we got in one mess I am not liable to forget. The details are not clear, but somehow the suction line of the pump in the barn was connected with our skim milk supply. You guessed it, before it was discovered, the pump filled all our water tank in the house. Even though the mixture was about half and half, the smell was something else. It took about 3 months to eliminate the possibility of having a part milk bath. Lib was not too enthusiastic about that water system. I used the pond as a water supply for spraying with the aid of a fast filler hose connected to the spray machine, and the kids in the neighborhood had a ball, until I checked with my lawyer about responsibility. The law says that if I were to build a 10-foot fence which included a locked gate, and anyone climbed that fence and was injured or drowned, it would be my responsibility. It would seem to be a stupid law when one considers all the water holes and open ditches in Lake Ontario, for which nobody carries any responsibility. We decided to buy a $10,000 insurance policy, but the most effective protection was a large sign on the bank of the pond which read, "This water is polluted with poison spray material." Untrue, but it kept the kids out. It was a shame to spoil their fun. These were drought years, and it was a pathetic sight to see a good crop of fruit begin to get smaller instead of larger as it neared maturity. Ralph Knapman and I tried to make arrangements with E.D. Smith Canning Factory, which had its own water pumped from the lake. We hoped to run a temporary on top of the ground line along the foot of the escarpment from their water tower to each of our farms. Brigadier Armand Smith was most cooperative and volunteered the use of whatever pipe he had available. If we could have included Jack Orr in our plan, it is possible that we may have succeeded, but Jack could not see a possible profit in the venture and refused to join. It looked too costly for just the two of us, so we dropped the idea. In 1956, the township put a water main up Homeside Avenue, a mere 500 feet west of the boundary of our farm, so I decided to go it on my own. The next spring, John Rogers dug the trench, and I put in a 2-inch water line to the west boundary to a cement meter box. This part was cast iron pipe. From there, it was almost 1,000 feet to the next cement box, located on a lane about halfway across the farm, a 2-inch plastic line. Both boxes were about 5 feet square and 4 feet deep, and with a 1.5-foot square hole for access and a 4-inch round hole to allow a standpipe from which to take the water. The top of the boxes were at ground level. From the second box, we used a 3/4-inch plastic line to get to the barn and house. Over 1/4 of a mile of pipe, all underground, a rather ambitious program, but what an improvement. That same year, 1957, I bought 1,000 feet of aluminum irrigation pipe with 15 sprinklers, another step towards the elimination of nature's hazards on the fruit farm. The cost of the whole water system, including irrigation pipes, etc., was right around the $1,000 mark, and I would suggest the second year of operation would pay the bill, even considering the cost of city water at 30 cents per 1,000 gallons. There is no accurate way to calculate the difference between irrigating and not irrigating an orchard because of the many unknown quantities of natural blessings such as rainfall, dew, or the capacity of the soil to retain moisture, but consider this. If you can increase the diameter of a 2-inch pear to a 2 1/4 inch and all the pears in the orchard are the same size, then the number of bushels harvesting will be doubled. The bonus received in those bushels of pears that have gained enough size to get over the minimum 2-inch diameter required by the factory's rules for number 1 pears. Add to these advantages the increased vigor of each tree for next year's production. It would seem quite possible that if the other fruit growers in the area were as interested in irrigation as Ralph and myself, that a cooperative venture could have been arranged to supply everyone with unlimited water for a very reasonable cost from Lake Ontario, only 2 miles distance from our farms and less to each of the others. A much larger venture would be to allow gravity to feed a large canal from Lake Erie to supply the whole Niagara Peninsula. In any case, you may be sure that my small efforts were well rewarded, because 2 out of every 3 years were dry enough to require irrigation. End of chapter 16.